Today, our topic is Rethinking Liberalism and Conservatism. And we're going to begin with a dialogue between Jesse Norman and Michael Sandel. Jesse is a member of the British Parliament and one of the most thoughtful conservative thinkers in the Anglo-American world. He serves as financial secretary to the Treasury, which means he's in charge of Britain's tax policy, infrastructure, and he's also helped spearhead the COVID response. But more than a politician, a distinguished one, Jesse is a philosopher. And he's written very interesting books on Adam Smith and Edmund Burke. And Michael, of course, in dialogue with Jesse, Michael's a political philosopher. His first book was Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. He's thought very reflectively over the years in a number of books, the latest of which is The Tyranny of Merit, about the state of not simply liberalism, conservatism, but also progressive politics, the whole range. So Jesse, why don't we begin with you and help kick off the discussion?
Well, let me just check. Yes, Kiku, thank you so much. And thank you, Michael. And what an absolute delight it is and an honor to be asked to join your gathering. I wish I was sitting at your table in Brookline and able to share a meal with you and have a proper conversation. And it is a great delight, even so, to be able to do so virtually. And you know, to debate conservatism and liberalism with Michael Sandel, I mean, I would run a mile in tight shoes in order to do that and more. So thank you. Let me say, if I may, that I want to free the conversation from any suggestion that I'm speaking as a member of parliament or as a minister or as a member of the Conservative Party, of any links, because one of the things I want to do is to start by thinking about this topic in a way that perhaps is free from taint. If I may, perhaps I can start by giving us a thought experiment, which is that I'm not going to talk about conservatism, I'm going to talk about something completely different, which I'm going to call conservation. And I want to define conservation for you, if I may, as a kind of political philosophy. And I want you to understand this is not connected to any existing political philosophy or any existing party or indeed person. And our conservation, as I read it, is a view of the world and of politics which seeks to preserve what is of value in society and seeks to orient policy around the preservation of what is of value in society. And it does so by accepting what we have as given. That is to say, it starts from a point of extreme realism. It looks around at what we have, at the nature of our society, and asks, how is it working? What is it? And how could we make it better? And it does so by interrogating the idea of society itself and noticing the extraordinary variety of its arrangements and of its institutions, and by attending to its history and its patterns of development and evolution. And so it's an idea, when you're seeking to conserve what is of value, you're not simply asking what is of value now, you're also asking how it came to be, because that may bear on how you might want to change it and improve it. So you're automatically in a position which respects, and even in some respects privileges, an understanding of the past and of the wider social context into which we are born, with all its weaknesses and its potential injustices. And as a political philosophy, it seeks to take this idea and then regard it as an inheritance and therefore something to be passed on in due course to future generations. So that's the broad idea. Now, the key thought here is that because you're conserving what is of value, you, by definition, cannot be seeking to conserve injustice, because I take it that injustice is rarely or ever of value, or if not of value, of enduring value. So it's going to be a view of the world which sets itself against injustice. And since injustice is pervasive in society, it's going to have a lot of potential ways in which it can get started in thinking in policy terms. But of course, it's also going to think about injustice according to a theory of change, which seeks to prevent the implications of its own policies from having negative effects of their own. So its theory of change is going to be one of gradual evolution and reform rather than of radical rather than radical change or revolution. Doesn't rule that out entirely, but that's not going to be its natural disposition. The natural disposition of conservation is going to be to take what you have, gradually reform in order to make it better, so that the process of making things better doesn't inadvertently create injustice en route. Now, this, certainly in the Western tradition, this will be a philosophy that is a philosophy of freedom, because it's a philosophy that seeks to acknowledge the value of humans as social animals and in their interactions. And since human freedom is improved and supported by institutions, and indeed by policies of redistributive taxation and of equitable allocation in government, then it's going to be supportive of those kinds of principles as well. So that is a philosophy I want to lay out for you, and I call it, as I say, conservation. Now, the reason I've used this somewhat indirect route, the big reveal, let there be no vulgar suspense, conservation is another word for describing my kind of conservatism that I believe in, radically distinct from many other bodies of thought that might use that name, and radically distinct from many parties which might use the name, and therefore providing a standpoint from which you can criticize other allegedly conservative positions and indeed conservative parties. So that's the view I want to put in front of you. And I think it generates an interesting contrast with liberalism, because my own view of liberalism, and this is one that Michael will want to pick up and I'm sure contest, is that it is a philosophy or a view of the world that arises from, as it were, a just so story about the march of human freedom as being something that has occurred over time, is inevitable, is somehow preordained by the way in which technology has developed, ratified by science, and therefore in some sense taking the individual as the benchmark of rationality and as it were, the morally basic unit. And I think if you take that view of liberalism, then you can start to see quite a strong contrast with what I'm talking about, because in the conservation viewpoint that I'm describing, human beings are intrinsically social animals. There's not, you cannot, it's not only logical to talk about the individual as an atom, it is incomprehensible, because individuals are formed and form others in their social interactions, and therefore can only be considered in their social context. And I think where you can start to see some of the contrasts come out is, for example, in not just in the attitude towards history, which will tend to be more dismissive from a liberal standpoint, but also in terms of how one thinks about the issue of duties. So in the liberal view of the world, it's hard, if not impossible, for the individual self as the sovereign entity to be saddled with unbidden duties. And therefore it becomes very hard to understand how past injustice could be something with which a present generation might feel any feeling of obligation, or indeed why an individual should feel a religious pull, because if the individual is, after all, taken to be the tenor and the mark of the moral, then it's not clear why there should be any further accounting of the individual to something greater, or indeed ineffably greater outside them. So I think you start to see some of the contrasts there. And I suppose the contrast that I think might be helpful, and this touch of Carol Gilligan about this, is to think of the individual in two different ways. One is as of an atom, that is to say, the final entity in any theory beyond which which cannot be further divided without ceasing to be itself. And the idea of the individual as perhaps the privileged or distinct point in a network or a web of relationships. And I think myself that the conservation view that I've described takes the latter perspective on the individual. There is no such thing as the individual. No man is an island entire of itself. And therefore, it's that intrinsically linked nature of ourselves that becomes the basis for a political philosophy. And let me end by making three thoroughly provocative claims, just to goose up the conversation, if I may. The first is that conservation, as I've described it, is descriptively superior to liberalism. That is to say, it gives a better description of how the most morally admirable people actually think in terms of their feelings of loyalty, their awareness of loss, perhaps feelings of patriotism, humility, modesty, a commitment to public service. I think conservation is normatively superior to liberalism. That is to say, I think a life lived according to principles of conservation is a better life than one lived according to principles of liberalism. It's more pro-social, it's less prone to individual or generational arrogance. I would suggest that conservation provides a robust and well-grounded viewpoint from which to assess and criticize political programs and parties, as I've said. And of course, it is not, above all, it is not conservation of injustice. It is not an apology or a defense of oppression or slavery or the like. Indeed, it is in many ways a basis from which to criticize and oppose them with great force and strength. Thank you very much.
So may I, Kiku?
Yes, please.
Well, thank you, Jesse. That was in short compass, really a splendid and thought-provoking case for conservatism as conservation. And as I understand it, it has two dimensions. One of them is about tradition, what exists, and the other is about individualism. Now, and my question really, Jesse, is how these two strands of conservation fit together. I find the second, you won't be surprised to hear, very attractive. I too think it's a mistake to conceive the individual self as unbound by encumbrances or duties, which may be bound up with tradition, be those traditions religious and spiritual, or secular, connected to community, country, history. So that I find very congenial. It's a further question. Clearly, this distinguishes a version of conservatism from liberal individualism. And there I'm with you. I don't think it necessarily contrasts conservatism from other forms of social democratic thought, which may not be liberal. So that's one question. But the other question is about the first formulation, which is that conservation seeks to preserve what is of value and to overturn what is not. That doesn't seem distinctly a philosophy of conservation or of conservatism, unless you add, and perhaps you would want to add, some account of what makes this or that institution or practice valuable. Because just by itself, the idea of preserving what is of value and overturning what is not, that's how justice comes in. That's how a critical perspective on existing arrangements comes in. That would be compatible, I suppose, with those, with the Robespierre, those who would fell the Ancien Regime. They too wanted to preserve what was of value and overturn what was not. They just thought that by and large, the regime was not of value. So, and Burke, of whom you've written brilliantly, Burke thought that the French Revolution went wrong and was dangerous because it wasn't preserving what is of value. But more than that, I think what you want, but you'll tell me if I'm wrong, is that from the standpoint of conservation, preserving what is of value isn't the only principle. The further principle is what makes something of value. A tradition, let's say, or a practice or set of practices and institutions is not to be decided or evaluated from some point of view wholly outside the tradition, but from within. Michael Oakeshott said that politics is the pursuit of intimations already present in a tradition. So if you want conservation or a kind of Burkean Oakeshottian conservatism, which I think is very powerful, and you've articulated on many occasions and in your writings, don't you have to add a further claim, which I think enriches but may complicate the position, that what makes the institutions and practices one would preserve valuable can't be derived from principles external to those practices?
Well, Michael, thank you very much indeed for that. I would say I think there's a great deal in what you've just articulated. I mean, of course, it is true. It's not something one can do in 8 minutes, but it is, of course, true that the viewpoint I'm adumbrating needs to give an account of what value is. And it's, of course, also true that that's going to have to be an account of value. That's going to have to be unpacked, as it were, as a further part of the discussion, as we are now doing. And it is going to be, I think it's going to have several components. I think one component is in terms of tradition and of tradition as encapsulated in institutions. That is to say, as institutions, as evolved entities that in evolving have managed to accommodate particular pressures and strains and desires and goals and aspirations that put them, as it were, that make them in some sense encapsulations of a certain kind of wisdom. And if that isn't a kind of wisdom that could necessarily be moved from one society to another, it's a kind of wisdom that the institution can share and the tradition can express within the society itself. In that sense, the value is to be realized in this intrinsic way. And you know, the neoliberal attempt to kind of lift and shift institutions into new areas fails in part because at a very deep philosophical level, it simply isn't working out any intimations that were ever previously there. And
then, Jesse, if I could, then here's a test, because we've been speaking abstractly, and I want to test your version of conservatism or conservation with a practice, and ask you whether you think it should be preserved or overturned from this point of view.
Sure.
Market capitalism, the C word, the other C word, capitalism. What does a Jesse Norman conservative say about whether we should preserve or overturn the version of market capitalism that we have?
Well, I think it's going to have, I won't surprise you to learn quite a lot to say on that. I don't think it's going to, I think you have to ask, I think there's an awful lot going on in that question. So let's just pick apart various bits of it. A conservatism that it will want to differentiate, or a conservation theory will want to differentiate between different kinds of markets and how well they're doing their jobs and how well established and successful they are. And so there are plenty of markets, one might call them haircuts and hamburger markets, which do their job extremely well and are, you know, highly efficient. There are other markets which are inefficient or rigged and clearly promote injustice. And we have well-established theories of why that injustice might occur: principal agent problems, problems of asymmetry of information or power, and the like. And that can give rise to coercive relationships that are not relationships of free exchange. And the view that I'm describing is I think going to come down quite hard on that, because those are forms of unjust exchange. So, and I think the kind of description I'm want to give is also going to ask a question. There is a problem here, which I want to come to, but it's also going to ask the question about whether certain activities are not in themselves distorting or impoverishing of society. So you might say that a society in which financial capitalism is too far advanced of a certain kind, or allows itself to become too far advanced, is a society that's being impoverished in terms of the use of its own intellectual and human resources, rather than a society that perhaps has a wider and more diverse spread of sources of wealth and sources of wealth creation. So I think there is a problem here. And the problem is that, of course, no theory of conservation of the kind I'm describing is going to want to give up a criterion for judging whether something is good or bad. And it's not going to want to accept the idea that just because something has always existed, it has any superordinate merit. That in the way I'm thinking, that is a certain kind of merit. It's earned its keep, but that's not an indefeasible merit. And there will be other considerations that you might want to use to overturn it.
So a
What I'm thinking
conservative,
of, Michael.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm thinking
Yeah.
it's a good time to open and
Yeah.
the discussion up to the group, and especially because this is such, as Michael said, you began philosophically, more abstractly. We're living in a world of very fractious politics. People are claiming they're conservatives in the US and other places, holding very different ideas, Jesse, than yours. And so I think what I'd like to do is think of concrete dilemmas that we're facing right now with these words: conservatism, liberalism, progressivism, and begin to look at as concrete cases. So I thought, Randy, let me turn to you for the first question or first point, to lead the discussion in on any aspect of what we've talked about so far.
Sure. There are two things that come to mind. One is, Jesse, your description of your type of conservatism made me think, oh gosh, I want to sign up for that. And in the American political schema, I'm way off to the left. But your description, I mean, frankly, your description of your politics could fit very well in, let's say, Dissent magazine, which is a magazine of democratic socialism. And so it seems to me that you really are going to have to become more particular, because from what I gather, you probably would not want to put your political eggs in the Dissent magazine basket. Secondly, and here I guess I think Kiku is really right. At this moment, I've never felt more trepidation than I have in the past year. And I still feel it. And one way in which that trepidation is directly pertinent to our discussion is, like I said, I'm on the left. I'm on the left edge of the Democratic Party in the United States. I have never felt more longing for the old style Republican Party. I never thought that I would, pray for the resuscitation of, let's say, Ronald Reagan. But one thing that has happened, frankly, in the last few years with, the ascendancy of Donald Trump has, in his own, in the brutal way in which he's changed the conservative party in the United States, namely the Republican Party, he has made certain types of conservatism more attractive. There are aspects of, George Bush, there are aspects of Ronald Reagan, there are aspects of the other Bush, there are aspects of, Eisenhower that are much more, Richard Nixon, don't forget Tricky Dick, Richard Nixon, much more attractive to me now than ever before. I mean, I never, I derided all of the people that I've just mentioned, derided them. I wouldn't have said hardly anything good about any of the people I just mentioned. That won't be the case with me going forward, because the fact of the matter is that the transformation of the Republican Party has made clear that there were aspects of the old Republican Party that really had a virtue that I didn't really pick up on. And because I didn't pick up on it, I'm sure I'm like a lot of other people, if you don't pick up on stuff, it withers and it loses force. And the United States, of America is feeling the effects of that. I pray now that the Conservative Party of the United States will find itself and will embrace large parts of the conservatism that, you know, resonates with you. Any of that, those are two comments that strike me.
I mean, thank you very much indeed, Randy, and what a wonderful comment. I suppose I'd say a couple of things. I mean, you remind me of that old Woody Allen joke about merging dissent and commentary to create dysentery. And I think that's some description of the way in which American politics has kind of changed a little bit over time. Certainly when I was living in the States many years ago, I spent 6 very, very happy years there. And the political parties were different. They were much more broad based, and they took a pride in that. And it was always regarded as it was always a criticism made by many political science professors in America that, you know, the American political parties were too broad based and all things to all men and all women, and they were not adequately kind of whipped and, you know, look at other countries and stuff. And boy, do we look for those days now. So I would say, I think the point's very well made. Now, one of the reasons I set out in these very kind of high philosophic terms the line of thought I did was precisely to underline a point, which is that there can be conservators, those who would follow a philosophy of conservation as I've described, in all political parties. And indeed in Britain, there are members of the Labour Party who are very clearly conservative members of the Labour Party. They're not conservatives by their political affiliations, but what they believe in are a certain kind of respect for institutions. And these institutions may be trade unions. Often it's the dignity of work. Really interesting topic that's been ignored by the right in Britain and I think rediscovered in recent years. And it sits at the heart of the COVID response that we've made. I've got 14 million people at the moment being supported in different ways across Britain by our schemes in the face of the pandemic. Why? Because we really understand something that we didn't understand 30 or 40 years ago, which is the commercial fabric of society, and the dignity that gives people and the work that they have is completely fundamental to their well-being and to the functioning of a proper market society. I think it's a very important insight. That's come from the right, the political right. And I think it underlines the point I make about the openness of this line of thought to strike echoes and to strike chords and as it were, perhaps create echoes in other parts of the political spectrum. The other point you said, I do think that, I mean, an area where I think one can see this a kind of cross-party commingling and coming together is in green policy. In Britain, you know, the Conservatives, in many ways, had a historic opportunity to be the ultimate Green Party and the first Green Party. Mrs. Thatcher started the work with an amazing speech in 1989, before these topics had really ever become public or fashionable, to the United Nations General Assembly on the importance of preserving the natural environment and the dangers that were being posed for it from all kinds of different players. Prince Charles, you know, said the same thing. And so in Britain, there has been a very strong, both political and non-political kind of belief in this, but it's only really become a matter of party politics in the full sense in the last 10 or 15 years. And yet it's intrinsic to the view of the world that I'm describing, that one would be seeking to have a very engaged and warm and active and supportive relationship to the natural environment, and would be worried about aspects of industrial capitalism that would be fighting that.
Jim Carroll, I'd love to hear your voice. I know you've thought very deeply about our present predicament. What are your thoughts? Just unmute, Jim.
Thank you, Kiku, and thanks for the privilege of being part of this conversation. Jesse, if I may, like Michael and Randy, I associate myself with your idea of conservation. I'm unabashed in referring to myself as liberal. You made only a passing reference to what you think liberalism is, and I'm struck by it, and I'd be grateful if you would elaborate. I didn't recognize liberalism in the little you said about it. for example, you said a liberal would have no truck, I'm paraphrasing, with points of reference outside his or her experience, for example, religion. I may have misunderstood you, for which I apologize if I did, but I thought I heard you saying liberals are by definition a-religious or anti-religious. Would you elaborate?
Well, thank you very much indeed for the question, and thank you for picking me up. And you will understand that if I had had more time, I would have found some word for liberalism that wasn't liberalism, but described the rather distinctive set of ideas that I'm associating with it in the same way that I have done with the word conservation. Of course, the problem with the words is that they have so many and so elastic meanings that we have to, if we're not doing a lot of, as it were, logic chopping and clearing up the dead word at the beginning, we find ourselves working with meanings we already have. The word liberal, as I use it, is not really a word that would be used in American politics particularly at all, because it describes the word liberal is a generic description for people who tend to be on the left of the American political spectrum. And I'm not meaning to associate that view at all with what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that in the classical liberal tradition in Britain, which is a tradition that reaches its apogee in the middle of the 19th century, Gladstonian liberalism, if you like, and there's of course an immediate counterpart, which is that Gladstone himself is a deeply religious man. But the essential idea is that the individual and the individual will is taken to be the moral touchstone of action. And when you have that view, just grant someone who has that view, and some people do have that view, you see it in some contexts. If you put the word neo in front of it, neoliberal, you can see the view perhaps a little bit more clearly. But when you have that view, then it's very hard to see that for that viewpoint to accept that there might be unbidden duties that such a will might take on. So it's essentially, it's the will as entering a social contract, if you like. And from where do these duties arise? Because the person entered a social contract which ceded a degree of sovereignty and empowered some sovereign entity to have control over them. That is as it were, a related tradition. And so when you have that idea, which is that the individual is really the contracting self, then it does become quite hard to see how that individual can have any duties that weren't ones that they'd freely accepted as part of their contracting process. And religion would fall into that. And so indeed, I think, would a sense of inherited responsibility for things that might have been done in one's own society, for which one feels ultimately that one has benefited. And certainly in Britain, you know, we are the product in this country of empire for all the good and ill that has with it. And certainly that's a question that's live. And if I think I still say, as a long time, as a deep Americanophile, a man who's lived in that country for 6 years, it's a topic that also exists in America as well.
Jim, how about a response? Because you say, on the one hand, you feel deeply in the liberal tradition, yet you are a very religiously committed person. So how in the US context would you answer, Jesse? And then I'm going to go, Gwen, be prepared. I'm going to go to you next.
Well, I take the point and I welcome the complication, Jesse, but first of all, I'd say we should have a kind of warning label on the discussion when we use the word liberalism, therefore, because what you're talking about in your overarching proclamation isn't the liberalism that is operative in American culture now. For example, the liberalism I associate with and defined by for decades, beginning perhaps with my response to Dr. King, it's the farthest thing from an atomic, hyper-individualist freedom, unconnected to the social contract, social obligation, or tradition. The liberalism I'm talking about, and I think I'm speaking within the mainstream of it here, is fully engaged with obligation the call to respond, the obligation to listen to history, to what's happening. The only example I would lift up is what's happened in this country over the last year, back with Randy's point of reference, in relationship to the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, a major summoning to which people have responded. And I would say there's been an essential liberal character to the response, have responded out of a full sense of obligation. People, liberals, but Americans, speaking broadly, without putting too much emphasis on the promise of this, have been conscripted into a profound act of self-criticism and self-examination, which has been an absolute manifestation of the social network and the social obligation of liberalism.
Jim, if I may say so, I think that's a wonderfully well put, and I entirely understand. And I apologize for not having put the kind of scare quotation marks around the word liberalism when I used it, because I, of course, was not intending to say anything that might be read as a derogation from or an insult or in any undermining way the liberalism that you, the humane, broad, inclusive liberalism that you have described. I was merely using the word liberalism, perhaps too philosophical a sense, to generate the contrast between a viewpoint, and again, the word neoliberal makes it a bit more obvious in the American parlance than the viewpoint that as we're privileged as the individual, and the viewpoint that sees the individual as an intrinsically social thing. And if I may suggest, and this may not be an implication of my view that you like, and I apologize if that's so, but I think there is something deeply conserving in the sense I'm describing the viewpoint that you have. And I think that's a rather a beautiful thing. And it leads me to feel a lot of warmth for the viewpoint that you describe, even though I might disagree with some of the politics of the way in which it expresses itself through the party system.
Well, I just would point out, the first thing I said, appreciating you, was I associate fully with the conservative
yes.
Notion that you've called
yes.
conservation. I fully appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So let's go to Gwyn, and then I want to go back to Jesse and then to Russ, who is actually both a political philosopher and in politics in New Hampshire, but to look at, like, looking at our real world situation in terms of our fractious politics and how in specific issues we can make our way between these, exhibiting in the US enormous polarities associated with these two words. Gwyn. Unmute.
Hello, Jesse, another English voice.
Hi, Gwyn. Hello, lovely to see you.
Not at Radio 4 anymore. But just to focus a little bit or think about the rethinking angle of this, picking up again on a kind of a longing for people that everyone's exhibiting, when you try and rethink these fundamental philosophies or ways of living in society, everybody has a kind of longing for things, selective things from the past. And I think, you know, I've just read, bizarrely, but I just read Waiting for Godot again. And, you know, there's Beckett and the most brilliant famous description of the plot where nothing happens twice. I think the pandemic particularly has made us, all of us, aware of a powerlessness and a kind of the sense of waiting while events unfold. You're sort of in the being tossed around by the winds of fate, if you like. And I think that's a common experience for a lot of people as the world unfolds around them. And I think for some of us who felt more at the heart of things, I think, you know, it's very good to have had that experience of impotence, if you like. So I'm hoping that that experience might give people a greater understanding of what it might be like to be very much outside of being able to exercise power. And, you know, I think when Randy's saying, you know, bits of conservatism from the past that please, you know, bring them back, there's no doubt now that things really are not going back. I mean, things are not returning to how they were. The states being rethought. It's fascinating, the differences and the similarities in America and the UK. Globalization's being recast, you know, by China. I mean, we used to think, oh, well, you know, democracy and liberal values in the American sense that we were just are going to follow globalization. No, China is recasting that. You know, the pandemic itself has made us see in nationalism and closing of borders a degree of sense of, it's almost sensible in some ways. So, you know, and supply lines have been shortened. So that's also having, so there's just so much going on that is new. And I think to try and come to terms with this, religion and nationalism, big forces now. I read an article by John Gray, a political philosopher that you'll all know, who's made a long journey from right to left, and he's somewhere else now. But his question is quite a good one, I think. I wrote it down, see if I can find it. It goes, do we have the conceptual flexibility to understand a society that harbors quite different views of the world now? I think both liberals and conservatives will have to accept that that is the situation. And it's hit people quite hard, and it's a good question. It's a conceptual flexibility, really, to think about how we want to live in our societies. So that's really all I've got to throw in. It's a very interesting discussion and a great subject.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Gwyn. That's a fascinating set of comments. I think there's no doubt that in Britain, at least, the pandemic has begun a process that is going to involve profound reevaluation in many different ways. And you've touched on some of them. I think the first one is going to be, this is an area where this is the second time in 15 years when we've had to pull the ripcord in a crisis and the state has come to our aid. And it's quite noticeable that actually in Britain, it's the nation state has come to our aid. It is the UK government using that collective risk-taking and borrowing capability that has been able to undergird all of the change that we've made. And you know, we may find that in Britain that changes. You know, maybe the argument over Scotland has changed because people realise in Scotland that actually they've had 3 experiences in the last 15 years when an independent Scotland would have really struggled: the financial crisis, the halving of the oil price, and then this. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is it's really underlined the difference between the people who do well in these circumstances and the people who do badly. I mean, you know, it's all very well, you know, zooming to each other from our, you know, the spare rooms in our houses is fine, but not if you're living, you know, in a very small flat with a lot of other people, and you know, you can't get out, and maybe under lockdown you've been kept in your home, and all those other things. I think it's also given us role models of energy and the potential to challenge some of the existing status quo and say, look, things don't have to be yet the way they were. You know, and it's hard for me not to mention my extraordinary wife who's been running our vaccines procurement process until the end of last year, because, you know, she's literally saved our bacon as a nation. And she did it through just sheer force of personality and drive. And, you know, that's a kind of Victorian spirit that if we could find some way of rebottling that and using that in our public service, it would be a marvelous thing to achieve. And if people could feel more widely that they could do such things by associating themselves with public service, then I think that would be nothing but good for our government and our state. And then, of course, finally, I think it also does remind us that a pandemic is an international problem. It cannot be, although the response may be national, the ultimate duty is towards an international collaboration that can rid the world of the pandemic. And it's no point just playing the short-term game and not seeking to support wider international efforts, because otherwise you just give the vaccine more chance, the virus more chance to mutate and to develop. And so I think all those lessons are coming out. We're only really beginning to think about what their implications are even now.
I want to turn to Russ, but beforehand, Huiling from Beijing has been, another young political philosopher has been with us. And Huiling, can you unmute? Are you able to join in on the conversation? Since Jesse mentioned China and more global dimensions, both of politics, of nationalism, your thoughts?
Thank you. And I think it's a very interesting topic. Recently, people here are getting more and more interested in the topic of conservatism, especially as the pandemic, during the pandemic thing. But when we talk about conservatism, I think it's a little bit different from the topic we are discussing now. Chinese are more concerned with culturally conservatism, and there is a very interesting misunderstanding of conservatism here, based on the translation of this word. It's mainly refers to someone in an old-fashioned way or not open-minded, and is in a negative meaning of conservatism. So my thoughts here about, but based on this kind of culturally misunderstanding of conservatism, some people combined the narrow sense of nationalism with conservatism, and so it's not a good inclination here of conservatism. So some people, there is a trend saying that we should go back to the old times or traditional Chinese culture, and there is some hint or some inclination of this. So I think it's a good thing for us to rethink conservatism and liberalism here, especially. I think here in China, we should talk more about the meaning of the conservatism, especially like the discussion at the very beginning was the value, was the what should we protect, or what should we preserve, not only culturally or even in the culturally speaking, what kind of values or traditions should we preserve? That's a really big question, especially during this difficult time. We should not mistake narrow nationalism with some kind of some how to say, some factors of the traditional or traditional culture.
Yes.
So,
thank you so much for the comment and the question. I think I suppose what I would say is this, that again, there are limitless ways to think of different forms of conservatism and to translate it into different contexts. I think and that's one of the weaknesses of the word, but I would distinguish between that and what you might call a reactionary position or an antiquarian position, which simply privileges the past over the present. And I've described various ways in which we can escape that trap. But I think you're right to point to, in a way this picks up a point that Michael made earlier, when we're thinking about traditions and the degree to which, as it were, traditions and institutions have earned their keep in the present and demand our respect. I think there's also a latent theory of human flourishing that needs to be added into the mixture. And I think there is a view within this line of conservation that I'm describing that humans flourish when they have a relationship with their environment and the society in which they are born, which is one in which they have the maximum affordance to develop their own talents and their own potential and capabilities. And so again, this is a kind of cross-political move. Those are often ideas that are associated with a certain kind of in Britain with the left, but actually I don't think they are intrinsically left-wing views at all. I think they're views that sit in this substrate of conservation that I'm describing. And when you have a theory of human flourishing like that, then and the individual as a social active agent rather than some passive recipient of state largesse or of a utilitarian, as it were, public policy, then I think you have a much richer conception of both what the individual is and what the society is as well.
One of the things that I find so, aside from these big terms, liberalism and conservatism, just the simple terms left and right intrigue me, and that they've been so resilient from the French Revolution to the present. That sort of spatial metaphor seems to work. And the left is the party of equality, that believes all people are equally worthy. And the right is the party of distinction or virtue, that thinks there's a basis for admiring some people, even more than we might admire others. And aims to recognize and preserve distinction on the assumption that the most distinctive distinctions can be deserved. And while the left wants to unmask all modes of unjustifiable advantage, and in fact has succeeded at making, turning the word privilege into a one-word accusation that puts people on the defensive. And I think these terms, liberalism and conservatism, is great, ultimately durable and magnetic public philosophies are mixtures of left and right. They have to be mixtures. And what I see in politics today is the decay of the mixtures. Left and right continue and act, but the mixtures are decaying as mixtures. And so the party of the left is becoming more of a left party. And it believes in its own cause so fully that it doesn't want to mix it with some sort of defensive distinction. And the party of the right, too, is more extreme than it used to be in the UK and the US, it seems. But just turning to the problem of conservatism and not the problem of Labor or the Democrats or liberals, it seems that conservatism doesn't know right now what kind of quality is really a genuine basis for distinction. And so the distinctions that it's looking to are the most debauched ones: race and nation, and maybe also sex. And so we see this in the UKIP and the resurgence of a certain kind of nationalism that culminates in Brexit. We see this, of course, in Trump and today's Republican Party. And I worry that that race and nation and sex are displacing what conservatism used to stand for as a distinction that is distinctive, which are the maybe more commercial virtues. As a student, Jesse, of Adam Smith, the commercials that, the qualities that are revealed in the way we contribute to common prosperity, that those were the virtues: hard work and maybe the courage to take risks. Those were the basis for real distinctions that in a commercial society are the core of conservatism. And those have given way to these more debauched distinctions, pseudo distinctions, like nationality and race. And so I guess my question is, can conservatism, as the party that believes in distinction, can it find its way back to a distinction that really is distinctive?
Gosh, there's an awful lot going on in those comments. Thank you, Russell. I suppose I'd say two or three things. I don't actually accept your characterization of the difference between left and right as being about, as it were, the right being a part of the political spectrum that rejoices in distinction. I don't think that's right. It might be that it accepts that society is a certain way and seeks to change that from that recognition, but without radically altering its terms for the reasons I've described. So I'm not sure I'd agree with you on that. I also think I don't think you've got British politics right. Burke famously described the Glorious Revolution of 1688 as a temporary deviation from the constitutional order. This was a circumstance under which a Catholic king was essentially driven into exile and a new Protestant monarch was brought in order to initiate a massive constitutional change. And Brexit is a temporary deviation in the order of things in Britain. If you look at Boris Johnson and the Johnson government, Boris has always been a centre-left Conservative. He was as mayor, he is as prime minister, and one of the reasons why the state has expanded as it has done is because it has a prime minister who believes that the state can be a very powerful force for good in many ways, and the pandemic has brought that out. But it was there before, and if you look at some of the spending decisions that were made by the government before the pandemic struck, you can see that then. Now, there has in Britain, for reasons you will know, over 400 years been a degree of skepticism and concern about developments in continental Europe. And in fact, it's older than that. And in many ways, UKIP is a Viking phenomenon. I mean, its sources of strength are the areas that were traditionally invaded by the Vikings in the northeast down to the southeast of England. But that issue is now past us. And fascinatingly, I don't think it ever really was a Trumpian moment in Britain. And I don't think there was a kind of native nationalistic aspect to it. Britain simply came to the view, having thought about it, that having tried being part of the European Union, that wasn't actually a forward move as it had been widely advertised. It was not inevitable. It could be reversed, and the British people decided in a referendum that it should be reversed. And the result has been no increase in xenophobia, I would say. I don't think there's any evidence of that. And the country is simply seeking to make its way. And what is quite interesting is that to have the pandemic now, to many people, has rather underlined the wisdom of that view, because the EU has found itself under some difficulty in coordinating 27 nations in a common vaccine policy. And Britain stepped out of that picture and has been able to work as a single whole relatively quickly, and very much for public betterment across Europe as well. I mean, not by any means with simply a little England or a little Britain view of it. I think it's also quite important just quickly to make distinctions that separate out what we think of as the theory of the thing from the party. I mean, the Conservative Party is a very heterogeneous institution, as you will be aware. And there have been times in the past where it's called for a more authoritarian view of the world, and times when it's called for a more libertarian view of the world, and times when it's been very much in favor of free trade, and times when it's been very much in favor of imperial preference. And it is a shifting thing. I don't think that means it lacks principles, but I think it does have a broadly inconsistent set of principles, and it has a magpie-like ability to choose which ones it likes to fit the political demands of the moment. And I think that's in its own way not really a direct comment on what we mean by conservation or liberalism, and it still remains useful to use those language and those themes to unpick what's going on at a deeper level.
I'm just going to refer to a debate that's going on in France that's actually that's within the party lines, and especially within the left, what is considered the left in France. I have to say, and I know all the French don't agree, and maybe Marc-Olivier won't agree with me, which will be really interesting, because as a French person, I consider myself as a universalist. And I'm also Jewish, which also has an impact. I'm totally within what Clermont-Tonnerre says: everything for the Jews as an individual, nothing to the Jews as nation. That's what was said during the French Revolution, that the Jews should be considered as individuals, not as a nation. And I extend this to every community. I think that I believe in a society where actually you should look at individuals first and not treat them as communities, that individuals don't necessarily think the way their community thinks. And where I want to go is that I've noticed in America these past 10 years, the growth of identity politics. Everything is about race, everything is about gender, everything is about gender orientation. And this for me is against everything I believe. I believe people, and I think this is where liberalism is going today. And I originally considered myself as a liberal, and now I don't, because I think today liberalism, at least in America, is only about identity politics. Every incident is seen through the lens of race, gender, or anything else, instead of looking at a number of situations that can explain a situation, a number of factors, circumstances. People jump to conclusions just looking at the color of the people involved or the gender of the people involved. And that bothers me a lot, I have to say. So that's what makes me further to liberalism today, at least the way it is in America. I will conclude in a way that in France now, it's really what's happening in the left is really interesting, because you have part of the left that thinks like me, that you should not try to think about the race. You should just look at people as individual. And another part of the left, on the contrary, is all about safe space for only Black people or only non-white people. And so there is this struggle within the left today in France, within the liberal, I would say the progressive side of France, which doesn't exist in America. I think in America, everybody is online with the identity politics on the left, except maybe for Mark Lilla or for Bill Mayer or Sam Harris, who I think is more of a progressive too. But most of the liberal today are totally involved in this. In France, the struggle, it's much more bitter between the people who believe in universality and people who believe in, you should look at the color of the skin first, because that's what explains everything in society. So that's my take.
Mark, response.
Oh, thank you. I don't know where I belong in that debate. I go from one way to the other. I swing back and forth. I really, but my comment was more on liberalism and conservatism, and I wanted to underline a fact is that in France, these are both bad words. Don't call somebody a conservative. It will be say no. And for example, when François Fillon, the candidate on the right for the last presidential election, he was seen by some as at last a conservative candidate. Well, he backed up from that label. When Macron appeared on the scene, he was, as you know, an outsider. Nobody really knew him. He didn't have a party. And he came forward as a bit of a liberal, but that's not the word he used. He talked of himself as a progressive, which is here in America, somebody more to the left, as a conventional liberal. And what I wanted to underline by making that remark is that these categories are really Anglo-Americans, I would say, and they may, like conservatism may exist in France, as you've described it, Jesse, as a disposition to preserve, but it's not articulated as such. And we should be careful not to see them as too broad. And they work within a two-party system, even though they're more general philosophy. They work well within a two-party system. In France, where we have a much more open electoral process, these labels don't really work. It's the left and the right, and even within the left and the right, there are multiple parties. who don't really like each other. And to go back to what you said on the universalist tradition you were referring to, which is really at the core of the French project, is closer to what used to be liberalism. But today it is indeed more people. We see people on the right in France claiming universalism, and sometimes as a way to act as safeguarding a national tradition. And sometimes France, I believe, struggle to accept it, not that it's living under multiculturalism, but that the French society is multicultural, and that you have also to take people with a part of their identity. Now, the word identity is really charged, and I don't really like it because it's closed. You can talk of origin. You can, I prefer the word origin because you can more as a person negotiate with it. Identity is it's a bubble, and it's really difficult to get out of it, I feel. Yeah, we should be careful about these labels, but we should also try to preserve them because they frame the conversation. I'm sometimes afraid that the conservative, what has become conservatism, has become a bit revolutionary. Thatcher and Reagan were revolutionary moments, and they were labeled as such. And Brexit, for me, also is a revolutionary moment. It's not preserving what exists and trying to better it. It's radically changing, implementing change, and I believe dangerous change, as we can see in Northern Ireland. Oh, thank you.
I ask quickly, drawing upon the two earlier questions from across the channel, Jesse. You've heard the suggestion that emphasize that the account of liberalism you've given, emphasizing universal human rights, the social contract, the individual will, the general will, the sovereign self, that this account of liberalism has, since Burke, been, for British conservatives, a pejorative name for France. What do you say?
Well, so what's the pejorative aspect of it, Michael?
Well, this is Burke's critique of the French Revolution, isn't it?
I mean, the ethics of vanity lies at its center.
Not the ethics of vanity, the idea to start anew and to overturn the ancien regime in the name of universal rights. Universal rights. Yeah, that's the idea, isn't it?
Yeah, I put the two together because I think Burke sees them in the same way. I think he sees them as the individual privileging that one individual restricted view of the world and using that as the basis. And it's the pain view. You know, we have it in our hands to make the world anew, whatever it is. From a Burkean perspective, that's completely incoherent. There can't be any, the legacies and continuities of the past are what define us, whatever we do. You can't make the world anew. It's an absurdity, and it's a corrupting and dangerous absurdity. And of course, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be constantly striving to do better with what we have, and nor indeed does it mean that under some circumstances, one might not rise up in rebellion if a settled order is being overturned, as was the case as he saw it in the American colonies. But I think there is a link between this kind of de novo recreative or destructively creative urge and a kind of individualistic view of the world. I think that's in a way why he doesn't accept the Robespierrean analysis that you started with, that you would have to show that the basis on which you were making things anew was much more widely grounded than just the thoughts of a few men. And of course, they were only men by and large, and they were all, with one exception, or one or two exceptions, under the age of 30. And if that isn't a recipe for disastrous political change, goodness knows what is.
So hold that thought, Jesse, that provocative thought. I want to turn to Sergio, if Nicholas is with us, and then Aaron Sendell, be ready, because to speak a little bit about the progressive point of view. So Sergio.
Thank you so much, Kiko, and thank you, everyone. I have a question both for our liberal friends and our conservative friends. My personal impression is that we live in an era of a deficiency of belonging, which I think is driven by the success of neoliberalism and globalization, but very much exacerbated by the pandemic. And so my question to my liberal friends is, do you, especially my French friends, is, do you believe there is a need of belonging? Do you believe there is a need to decline a sense of patriotism from a liberal perspective, from a leftist perspective? And to my conservative friends, my biggest fear in the way in which a sense of belonging is declined by conservative parties in Europe and the United States is the idea that often, especially in the United States, we've seen it's declined through nativist, xenophobic themes. So my question is it possible to detach, to fully detach a conservative understanding of belonging from these themes? And to what extent can we rethink the sense of nation altogether beyond the idea of race, even language? So these are my questions.
I think the distinction between progressive and conservation, I haven't been able to identify the difference in my conception of progressive, which, if Randy is thinking he's on the left end of left, I'm not sure how far beyond that progressive is, and I don't know where I would find myself, but in an abyss, maybe I would catch on to conservation in the process. But I think just the one note to maybe to our friends from France, this seems like a great depiction of a definition, like Anne, you give a great definition of liberalism, the universality, everyone should be seen as an individual. And from that perspective, I understand why it might irk you that folks are thinking about someone's race, someone's gender, and these other traits. But I think one of the things in American progressivism is the identity politics that's now used as a pejorative by liberals and by Fox News Republicans alike. But what identity politics is creating a theory of oppression. And it's making sense of the fact that you see injustice here, you see injustice there, and then you start to notice the patterns and you say, oh, sometimes it's related to racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism. Sometimes it's related to gender discrimination. You see that Black trans women are experiencing this even more. So it's actually never about any one trait. That's not what identity politics is. It's about realizing these are all tied up together. It's the same injustice is actually appearing in transphobia and forms of class oppression. And it's the same reason why someone in a wheelchair can't get to a public building. It's like you're noticing it. This is the same thing going on. And I think that's what, if going back to the 70s or whenever, when people started really thinking about identity politics, that's what it is. It's a theory of justice, and it's a theory of oppression, which is tied to also capitalism, is being the same forces that are fighting for capitalism are the same ones that are fighting to oppress people who are not wealthy white men. And I think conservation seems great. And I think it sounds, I'd be curious, Jesse, whether you would agree then that the people who are fighting for like the Black Lives Matter movement is a great example of conservation.
Is that for me, or should we, or do you want to say
Yes,
more?
please, Jesse.
Okay, well, great. I think that's a very interesting analysis, Aaron, and I think there's a lot of a great deal in what you say. And of course, the thing does manifest itself differently, probably in Britain and in America, and it's not obvious why capitalism, as you've described it, should have anything like the attitudes in any intrinsic way. It might be a contingent fact about the way in which it's worked out, but you know, a well-functioning. I'm not a great fan of capitalism as a word. I prefer the Smithian phrase "commercial society," but it's not obvious that commercial society has any interest other than in treating people, as it were, on an equal basis for whatever contribution they can make as entrepreneurs, irrespective of race or color or religion or background. Now, there is a critique which says, look, if you don't have some assets to start off with, you can't get into the game. And therefore, the functioning of market society is intrinsically hostile to people who have nothing. In Britain, there isn't as much social mixing as there used to be, and social mobility as there used to be, and in part that's because of completely different factors of assortative mating, basically, you know, middle-class kids marrying each other rather than the duke's son marrying the you know, some townsgirl, to put it as matters of the broadest caricature. But you know, we have a very supportive welfare state which does allow people to succeed and flourish, and we have a thoroughly progressive system of state student loans which allow people to get a good education if they can, and so we do everything we can to try to give people a shot at the kind of movements in their lives that would overcome whatever, as it were, barriers might have been placed in their way by others. I think I would say that there's a very warm place for, and indeed this is a very provocative point, but I think the idea of checking your privilege, which is what goes with an awful lot of this thinking in Britain, at least, is the phrase, is in many ways a rather conservative idea, because what it's saying is go back and look at what are the historic sources of the benefit that you are enjoying in your life. And I quite like that, because I think it is important for us always to be as nuanced and as aware as possible of you know, on what basis we've been able to succeed, and what and therefore in some sense what we owe to society and what we owe to others in virtue of the privileges we've received. And that is a bit you know, that's a kind of traditional view, but it is one that I think strikes quite a wide chord amongst people, certainly in Britain, and I'm sure in America as well.
Well, just a quick response of why capitalism is lumped in with all these horrible things like white supremacy and gender discrimination is, it strikes me, I mean, it's interesting that that you're saying in the UK, it's the right that has identified the dignity of work. I think that's great. And it's something that in our last session, we had a really interesting discussion about work, and Rust raised the provocative question, should we maybe disassociate salaries from our employer? And I'd be curious to see, okay, well, what qualities should we be having in a commercial system to begin with? Should housing and healthcare and food cost anything to begin with? That would, maybe we don't need a welfare state. So part of it is, oh, capitalism might require a welfare state. But what struck me, Jesse, is that it almost came, perhaps it sounds like that as a surprise to you that people found dignity in their work. And if that's the case, I think that would make sense, that to someone who's so bound up with a commercial economy, it might come as a surprise. And out of that, you've created this great philosophy of conservation. But that, to me, is now you've come to what an American progressive might agree with.
Well, I mean, just very quickly to respond to that, I was really just pointing to a way in which British political thought had reverted to an understanding perhaps it had in the past of the dignity of work, and had kind of reached an equilibrium between, or a better understanding of that in the context of the wider functioning of markets. I mean, it may be of some interest. Many years ago, I was on the board of what was essentially the only group pressing for greater employee ownership in Britain. And in the year 1900, the left of British politics was an astonishing kind of seething mass of interesting ideas, working men's clubs and mutuals and cooperatives and employee-owned organizations and unions and just a whole range of things. And what's extraordinary was the left then became collapsed to being about a politics of unionism. And all those other institutions, many of them quite conservation oriented, dropped out of the picture. And it's always been my view that they should be part of the picture. And therefore, it's another way in which the kind of line of thought that I'm adumbrating reaches across the traditional political parties and political spectrum.
Kiku, could I take up Sergio, a strand from Sergio's question?
Please.
Sergio was asking about belonging and nationalism. And if I could put a sharpened, not sharpened, but a restated version, more pointed version, less polite version of Sergio's question. That's what I really mean, less polite version of Sergio's question.
Sergio's was pretty pointed in the first place, but yes.
Okay, less polite. Aren't liberals and conservatives both complicit in xenophobic nationalism and, for that matter, religious fundamentalism? Conservatives are complicit because of their sometimes uncritical embrace of what is, to go back to your initial formulation, Jesse, including the prejudice for one's own kind, into which we easily slide. Liberals are complicit because of their embrace on the unencumbered self, who rejects moral ties antecedent to choice or to a contract. And here I hasten to add, this is not the Jim Carroll kind of liberal, but a recognizable one nonetheless. Liberals are complicit because of their embrace of the unencumbered self. They insist on a neutral public sphere that becomes so emptied of moral and spiritual and religious discourse that it creates a moral void that is invariably filled by either by narrow moralisms, typically xenophobic nationalism or religious fundamentalism, which had been prepared in a way by some conservatives in the way that I described. Sergio, is that a fair, impolite reformulation of your question about nationalism and belonging?
Yes.
Well, I thought Sergio's question was extremely well pointed, extremely well made, and thank you, Michael, for giving it further pungency in a brilliant Sandelian formulation, encompassing both sides of the political debate. I think, let's just take the liberal side first. I think in the way you've characterized it, there is a danger of a moral vacuum, because it so easily slides into the idea that the human being or the human individual is the fundamental source of merit or moral values. So he quickly slides into a rather solipsistic and utilitarian view of the world. And I think that can actually be very morally vacuous. On the right, sorry, I should dispense with that. In terms of conservation, I don't think it's a right or left view. I think there is some force to the point that if you take what there is and you ask who is the we for whom this value is to be preserved, that predisposes you towards the people in your society, in your nation, your neighborhood, however one might like to define it. And I think it is a psychologically accurate description of human beings that they tend to operate in that way. And Smithian circles of sympathy is an idea that he doesn't just live from the Stoics, he also, I think, takes it as a description of how people think. I don't think that means they have to be xenophobic. I think that can coexist with an openness towards the other. Of course, it is interesting that the word xenos itself can mean a guest and someone you welcome into your house, although they are foreign to you. And so I don't think that we have to abide by the idea that because people's psychological reference points tend to be closer to them and they tend to have a psychological instinct to favor those around them, that they are therefore automatically hostile to others. Certainly in Britain, I mean, the joke of Britain is a multicultural society, has been for hundreds of years. And the idea that somehow the Brits have suddenly become xenophobic when did Britain last have an English monarchy? I mean, this one, as you know, is the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Before that, we had the House of Hanover. Before that, we had the House of Orange. Before that, we had the Stuarts from Scotland. Before that, we had the Tudors from Wales. So we haven't had an English king. And I think the Brits are pretty broad-minded as a result of that. I don't think that's perfect, but I think we can resist the idea that there has to be some natural instinct to xenophobia or nationalism, because there is this psychological tendency to deal with what you have in front of you and to work with your, and indeed to some extent in your policy to privilege your neighbors and those in your surroundings.
So let's have two more comments, Marc Olivier, and then I'd like to hear again from Russ, and then we can wrap up. It's been an incredible discussion. Marc.
Yes, thank you for letting me speak again. And I just wanted to answer Sergio's question about the question of belonging and liberalism. Even though in France, liberalism is a bad word, it's still a liberal society. And I believe that the possibility of belonging is there within us, liberalism, that you can, they can coexist, like in front of every French school, you have like 3 French flags, so there's a sense of a nation, even within a liberal society, and that it doesn't mean that one is pushed back or unable to exist because of the other. And in fact, the French motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, with fraternité or brotherhood, you have a sense of belonging, of being in all this together, that we're not just monads, as some critiques of liberalism say today. And I believe also that to present liberalism as creating some sort of a vacuum on a moral perspective, I find it a bit misplaced. It only creates a space where moral can be discussed, and there's not only one perspective on moral issues that wins over. And I believe it is important to preserve that space so that there's not one perspective that just, as I said, takes over. And I believe also that the conservatives have a very important role to play, because as Jesse said, it's not because you're conservative that you're necessarily xenophobic, but your neighbor on the far right maybe, and you have to be able to preserve the distinction between the two and say, well, they're my friend, you're going too far. In this respect, the people on the right, even though as you said, I disagree with you on this, Jesse, where you say that conservatism is not necessarily on the right. Let's just say, for the sake of the conversation, as it is generally seen that conservatism is on the right, that the center right has a responsibility to say, well, a line here has been crossed. So Trumpism is a bit too far. and we should stay within certain boundaries and accept not to go where exclusion begins.
Thank you. I'm just so heartened by the conversation in many ways. I'm really happy to hear. I'm happy to hear Jesse separate Johnson from UKIP and from the populist wave of nationalist self-assertion that's characterized politics all over in recent years. I hope that Boris sees himself, as clearly in the mirror that you fashioned for him as I see him now. And just thinking about the relationship between UK and US politics, it's common to kind of partner Reagan with Thatcher and see them as part of a common moment somehow that bridges the ocean, and to partner Blair and Clinton also. And the question is, who's the partner for Boris Johnson? And there were those who thought the right partner was Donald Trump. But listening to you, it's actually perhaps another person of the center left, Joe Biden. So maybe this is the moment of Joe Biden.
I think you'll be surprised by how well Joe Biden and Boris get on.
Yeah, so I'm heartened by that. Thank you.
So, yeah.
Actually, I thought, Russ, you were going to nominate Bernie Sanders.
Well, this has been a great discussion. Jesse, we want to thank you for really presenting a deeply thought out, philosophical, and very affirmative view of how we could see conservatism in these days as conservation. And two of your key points is that we live in a web of connections. We're all connected to each other, and that we can't lose sight of that we can't see individualism as a form of separation from those connections. And that also this speaks to looking at the sense that we have of solidarity to examine questions of justice. If we are engaged in pursuing the virtues of the past, we have to evaluate those in terms of how just they are, and did it serve the public good? And so I think that these profound questions really open up an area of affirmative conservatism. And of course, Michael, your critique of liberalism philosophically and in all of its cases that you raise in your books makes us in very concrete ways be able to think about issue after issue and how we are going to get our moral bearings and resuscitate our civic life. Russ, I thought that your point about the decay of the mixtures was really a great point because though we're having this discussion today, it's almost unrecognizable as affirmative as it is in terms of the contentious and polarized politics in which we live, where in the US, the conservative agenda is hostage to the party of Trump as we speak. And in other parts of the world, what we say about right or left or conservative, liberal or progressive have very different meanings as they're expressed within fractious political parties who are not listening to each other, and that we've lost that ability to come together as a public. So I want to thank Jesse very much for joining us, Michael, for the dialogue that began this discussion, all the participants from all over the world, and we'll meet one last time as a group on May 2nd at noon, where we'll look at the topic Speaking Out When Conscience Contends with Power, and we'll have leading off the discussion people who have actually been engaged in doing that from different parts of the world. So thanks again, and we'll be getting together soon.
It's been such a privilege. Thank you, Kiku. Thank you, Michael.